Hi. Welcome to this little section. I'm really delighted to have a wonderful woman with me for this part, who's called Denise, and she has a fabulous story to tell us. She is a long-standing mental health campaigner and has a experience as a patient of many mental health services, and has got a particularly interesting story which weaves in and out of many years. So Denise, you're very welcome, and I'm really excited for you to tell your tale and share all your different points with us. So, welcome.
Thank you, Isla. So I'll tell you a little bit about my background. I had a very difficult childhood, like a lot of people who use psychiatric services, and I was first put on psychiatric drugs at the age of 12. That was only for a short period, but life was very difficult through my teen years. By the time I was in my mid-20s, I had my first hospital admission to psychiatric ward, and again that was fairly brief. I then got on with my life. I was working and everything. However, when I was in my mid-30s, I became very distressed and very disturbed. I was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, which I believe I had a complex post-traumatic stress disorder, but it doesn't, I have my issues with diagnosis, but it doesn't concern me greatly. So I was taken into hospital in 1992, and quite a few weeks admission. And that was the beginning of numerous admissions, sometimes as a voluntary patient, sometimes as a sectioned patient. Sometimes you were going as a voluntary patient, and then you would be sectioned once you wanted to go sectioned. At that time, the wards were all mixed sex. There were no sex wards. They were all mixed sex, and they were fairly big. There were lots of. They're still fairly big. The hospitals I was in. So I was very unwell for about quite a few years, and it was decided that I should be given electric shock therapy, ECT as it's known. At the time, by that time I'd already had numerous admissions, and I was doing a little bit of campaigning, mainly to improve conditions on the wards. But when I had the ECT, what they said was I overconvulsed. There was a problem with the ECTs. In the final therapy session, I overconvulsed, and I was very manic, and I was behaving wildly. I was jumping on tables, I was setting off the alarms and stuff like that. And I remember it, although kind of is a little bit, some of it is hazy, but I was then, I wasn't actually sectioned at this time. They put me onto a section 3, which is, they can hold you for up to 6 months. They can then resection you again at the end of 6 months, and also they can forcibly drug you. So I was moved to an intensive support area on the ward. And I think there were 3 small booths. It was an open ward with 3 little rooms. I don't think they had doors on them. So there were 3 rooms, and there was one man in there, and he had a couple of nurses with him constantly because he was a very disturbed man. I was about 40 at the time, and he was he was about in his late 20s, early 30s, and he was quite tall. I'm 4 feet 11 inches tall. So I was there with him, but he and I didn't row. I didn't really speak to him at all. But I was a bit noisy. So I remember saying to him, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry I'm making so much noise." And that was it. That was the only. But then I settled down. However, a couple of days later, I was out in the hallway of the hospital, the ward. And I would say that in this hospital, all of the communal areas are mixed sex. There's a small corridor with women's beds, a corridor with the men's beds, but they're kind of mixed up because to go to the dining room, the sitting room area, all of these things, you had to go into the men's sections. You're in the men's section. And this ward that I was in the men's section. So anyway, I went into the corridor, and I was with a young woman nurse because they were closely observing me because of how I was behaving.
Mm-hmm.
And this, so I was on the phone, and this man, I saw him walking along the corridor towards me. There were no other nurses around, and the nurses went with him. And as I put my hand over the phone, he was waiting for the phone. I put my hand and says, "I'm sorry, I won't be long." And he started swearing at me, saying, "You've said sorry once too often," or something, because I think previously I'd said sorry about the noise. And he just lunged. No, I said, I can't remember what I said, would go to hell or something, because he was quite abusive. He swore at me. And I carried on, and he just grabbed my hair. My hair was quite long at the time. And he just beat the living daylights out of me. The young woman nurse was trying to hold him off, but he was a strong man, and he was shouting the most vile obscenities. Not a single nurse came. The place was empty, although I gather some of the patients were watching it from the communal sitting room through the window. So he was beating me up. But as I was by the phone and the nurse was trying to hold him off, I dialed 999 and I said, I'm being attacked on the ward, or on a psychiatric ward. They asked me more clearly where I was. I told them what hospital I was in, on the psychiatric ward, and they said, "We don't speak to patients on the psychiatric ward." This was 999. I'm beating, and he was punching me in the head and bashing my head against the wall as I was holding the phone and speaking to them. And they said, "No, we don't speak to patients. You need to get a nurse if you want us to speak to someone." So I handed the phone over to the young nurse. Meanwhile, he had me down on the floor, and he was just battering me senseless. So after a little while, obviously the nurses were speaking to them, but the police then realised there was something going on. They must have alerted the nurses who were in the nurses' station, because suddenly loads of nurses came running down the corridor and grabbed me. But he was still fighting to get to me, and the obscenities he was shouting just world. So that was absolutely traumatic. I was black and blue all over. Like chunks of my hair had been pulled out, and handfuls of my hair had been pulled out. And he disappeared, and they took me back to the original room that I had been in before they moved me to the high support area. And I was very distressed. And the nurses told me I wasn't allowed to talk about it, because it would involve them having to talk about a fellow patient, and they couldn't do that. So if I tried to talk about it, they would forcibly inject me, or they would force me to take drugs against my will to silence me. I think it was the next day, a police officer did come to the ward and interviewed me. I had a chunk of hair which had been pulled out. I found it on my shoulder, so I showed this hair to the police as he's pulled this out, and my arms were just black, both my arms. And my back, everything was in a dreadful way. And when I showed the hair to the police officer, he started laughing. So anyway, I was told nothing could be done about it. I wasn't allowed to speak to any of the staff about it. And I was kept away from all of the other patients in another room for a while. And meanwhile, when I had to go for meals, queue up beside this man, he was shouting he was going to kill me and whatever. If I got upset or I got angry in any way, or shape, or form, I was frog marched to my room and forcibly medicated. This went on for about 10 days, but this time I was desperately stressed and very, very upset. And again, still being told I may not speak to any of the staff about it. I was told I had to say nothing about it. So after about 10 days, I was moved to another ward. By this time, I was just crying non-stop. And I wasn't cooperating with them, because every time they wanted me to go to the room, they were forcibly drugging me, and I didn't want to be forcibly drugged. So things got really out of hand at the other ward. They were dragging me around the ward. My mother phoned on one occasion, and one of the patients said, "If that's Denise's mum, come to the hospital, get her. They're dragging her around the ward and treating me like shit." They told me that if I cry, if I got upset, they took my Ventolin off me, and they said, because I had asthma, they would return it if I showed that I could behave myself. If I stopped crying, if I quieted down, they would return it. They also said at one point they would refuse to allow me visitors. I had to show them that I knew how to behave myself. Bear in mind, I had just had ECT. I'm guessing I had some kind of brain injury, which is because I had partly overconvulsed. I had too high a dose.
And basically, because you were both under section, what the police were saying was that neither of you were competent to testify against one another.
That's what happened. So at that point, my mother and my sister came to the hospital, and they were moving from the hospital. The so nothing was done. Nothing. I heard nothing more about what happened to this man initially. The police were not prepared to take any action because we were both under section. At this point, there was nothing I could do. So I was taken home. I went back home, and I was desperately upset. I was still banned from discussing with any member of staff in the hospital.
Mhm.
I do remember one nurse being very nice to me. A couple of the nurses were very nice to me, could have seen what happened, tell us what happened, but they had been told they were not to do that. So
Mm.
anyway, so nothing happened. I was then diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder on top of my existing diagnosis as a result of the assault. I went to see a solicitor to find out if I could take action against the hospital, and the hospital said to me that the solicitor said to me, because I already had mental health problems, it would
Mm.
be impossible to separate what was my existing problem from the newly acquired post-traumatic stress disorder. I couldn't prove that I was harmed. There were no photographs of my injuries, nothing. So that was it.
Mm.
Meanwhile, because you go into hospital, the ward you go into is according to your postcode. This man lived quite near me. So occasionally I saw him in the street, and he was shouting threats to me. He was and there were things like "get a rope, I'll help you hang yourself," and all sorts of horrendous stuff. I was in the middle of a supermarket one day, and I hear his voice shouting at me across the supermarket. This went on for about a year. Apparently, he was then moved to another area as a result. Another thing that was happening with him, and that was that. But I then sat on the police liaison committee at that hospital trust as a result of that.
Right.
Uh, and at that point, my main concern was to get the police to take these things seriously. And I think as a result of my involvement, the police did agree that they would take calls from patients on psychiatric wards. But prior to that, they weren't doing that. So that was that. In the meantime, I had heard about loads and loads of women being assaulted. It's not just sexual assault. People are talking a lot about sexual assaults.
Yeah.
There's a lot of violence, a lot
Yeah.
of violence.
Yeah.
So, for example, one woman, a friend of mine, was knocked unconscious, punched unconscious by a man on the ward. They took her across the road to the local general hospital for, I think it was 48 hours or something, and returned her back to the ward with the man who had knocked her unconscious. There were constant threats of violence. One man was threatening me with a pool cue. I had never spoken to this man. The reason he was threatening me, told the nurse, was because I was stealing his thoughts from his brain, which is, a feeling that a lot of people with certain mental health problems sometimes have.
Mhm.
So there were all sorts of strange things. We used to see men sometimes wandering around with their penises out or masturbating in front of us.
Yeah, I remember when care in the community started, because I was living in Balham at the time,
Yeah.
and there was a massive psychiatric hospital near Balham. Because I suddenly remember that they shut it down, and then suddenly there was loads of people who were incredibly unwell just walking around the streets,
Oh.
because they didn't know what to do and they didn't have anywhere to go, and it was really a weird sort of change, you know.
And they had day centres, but they closed those down as well.
Right. So we just done a little shimmy to cut out the background noise that we were getting on this. So yeah, carry on, Denise. You were just talking about all the kind of ins and outs, and and it kind of brings back some memories, because obviously I had to do a bit of psychiatry in my time, and I did find it actually quite frightening. Just being on in those environments, and I remember quite a lot of police incidents, and having to. There was a lot of real, like, desperately violent events with people smashing up the place,
Right.
and people escaping, and police, etc. But um one of the things, I mean we're talking, I was in the NHS, I've got 30 years, but one of the things is staffing issues, and mental health staffing has always been a real issue. But obviously, with your advocacy and lobbying work, you'll know that staffing has just got worse and worse and worse and worse. So I'm really worried about the experiences for patients now, given that a lot of the staff are agency staff. There is no continuity of care and
Yeah.
relationships.
Yeah, there has been a, because although that happened a long time ago, my most recent admission was about 7 or 8 years ago. I haven't
Right,
been admitted since then. I would just say, after that incident, after what happened to me, there were a couple of occasions in the street where I passed a nurse who'd been in the ward, and on 2 occasions, because I live very close to the hospital, nurses come up. Well, one nurse came up to me and said, Denise, I just stopped me in the street and said, I want you to know I thought it was terrible the way they treated you on the ward. And another nurse, this was an agency nurse, stopped. I was standing at a bus stop and he came over and said, Denise, if you think things were bad on the wards then, you should see them now. So the nursing staff became less and less, and also there was less interaction. There's been less interaction. So at one time, the nurses would come and talk to you. They would, they would mix with the patients. Now that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen at all, really. The other thing is there are less. There seems to be, my last admissions, there were less nurses about on the ward. There may have been as many on the shift, but you didn't see them. You didn't see them around. There are lots of little nooks and crannies in psychiatric wards. So things happen, it can happen and do happen. And also you have interaction. This is something that someone who's working in the NHS possibly wouldn't be aware of, that there's a lot of interaction with patients outside of the ward after they leave the ward. So after they leave the ward. So, for example, at that time there were day centres. You would see the person that attacked you at the day centre. There was and also there was what we call the survivor movement. We were the people who used mental health services. We were campaigners. We set up things. We set up groups and such, and people came along. So there was a sense of which, oh well, let bygones be bygones, forget it. So he beat you up in the ward. So he raped you on the ward. And there were women who I was at events and there were women there saying, that man he raped me when I was on the ward, but he would be at the event just the same as her. I never heard of any man ever being charged for raping a woman on the ward, for beating up a woman. And it seemed to me, I don't know what the actual legal position is, but it is, people don't press charges against people that are on psychiatric wards. Whatever they do, and that's it. So, and you're right, they're frightening, violent places. And sometimes men are just walking around half naked because they're not aware of what they're doing. Same with the women sometimes. I want to tell you one little incident that I found quite offensive. And this involved nurses. It was a sort of open plan communal area, and there were lots of men and women on the ward. And there was a young woman who started arguing with the staff, and it escalated, and they were shouting at each other. And they decided to what we call crash her. So they hold her down and pull your underwear down, inject you in the bottom in front of everyone, basically, and then take you to the room. And this woman, so we were all standing around, men and women, and this woman, and there was a bit of a struggle, and she was wearing a Santa towel, and the Santa towel came out of her underwear and sort of slid across the floor. Now, we were all standing watching this. She was then, disappeared. We were put told to go into her room. She disappeared. We didn't see her again for a day or two, and that sort of thing. There is an idea that that's just part of the rough and tumble of being on a psychiatric ward, and I think also there's a certain amount of very old-fashioned discrimination, that people on psychiatric wards are not aware of what's happening. They're not really cognizant of what's going on around them. That's not actually true. You may not be able to respond to things. You may be acting strangely, but you generally are fully aware of what's going on around you. And I was liking it to, when a child is sexually abused, the child doesn't know how to respond, doesn't really understand what's happened. But then, 20 years later, the child is now an adult, will turn around and say, you abused me. And the person might, I thought you weren't aware of it at the time, because you can't deal with it then. But at a later date, someone will say, this happened to me on the ward, or that happened to me. And they are violent, disturbed places, and men get attacked too on the wards, but obviously not to the same extent, and they don't have the constant sexual harassment.
Yeah, there's a lot of sexual disinhibition that often runs along with a lot of
and that is a symptom. That is a known symptom of certain mental. So can I just say one thing also? But when I was on what they call maximum observation, where the patient had to be arm's distance, they could never
Yeah.
be further than arm's distance from you. I
Mm.
do remember male staff coming into the toilet, into the cubicle,
Mm.
and that was the thing. If I happened to have been assigned a male nurse, the male nurse would go into the cubicle while you were doing the toilet. Now, they were nurses, and
Mm.
obviously it wasn't a problem. But there's a sense of having virtually no privacy,
Mm.
no dignity. You lose all your dignity. And a lot of the behaviours on the psychiatric wards are a response to what's happening on the ward rather than the person's mental health condition.
Mm.
If you're sectioned, you cannot leave the ward. And the patient, if someone attacks you, does something, there's nothing you can do. You're stuck there.
Mm.
And you cannot. The police are not interested in pressing charges. I don't know what the law is. I don't know what the legal situation is. But I've known numerous of serious assaults, and I've never known anyone on a psychiatric ward being charged with
Mm.
violence or rape.
And what's the advocacy situation in terms of, monitoring of this sort of deprivation of liberties and the safeguarding?
Yeah, the government at some point in the early 2000s introduced an advocacy service where someone was legally entitled to have an advocate. I'm not sure what's happened with that. I was involved in setting up one of those advocacy services, but I have to say that at that time, the user survivor movement was very strong. So
Mm.
we actually held meetings on the wards. We,
Mm.
we set up I can't remember what we called it, users council,
Mm.
and every month the managers on the wards would attend a meeting with us. We would set the agenda. We had held in the boardroom of the hospital. It was taken very seriously at that time, but they never really did get to grips with the violence. Sometimes I've been there when the police have arrived with dogs and riot shields, but they've been called by the staff for possibly drugs, someone taking drugs or whatever.
Mm.
And the police generally didn't respond to service users. So, it was a very scary and grim time. I would say some of it was very funny as well. Some of the things that happened were quite hilarious. But they were scary, violent, aggressive places, and being
Mm.
in a psychiatric ward in itself was quite traumatic.
Mm.
So I got involved in a campaign for women on the psychiatric wards. This was in the late 1990s. I think about 1999, we did a survey on women's experiences of the psychiatric wards, and they were all the same sort of thing that I've told you about: women being attacked, women being raped, women being sick, and constant sexual harassment, constant. Um, and they did at that time. The hospital I was involved with, one of the biggest in London, well, it's one of the biggest in the UK. They did introduce a single sex system fairly quickly,
Mm.
mainly because we were lucky. We had one woman director in a senior position in the hospital, and she decided that's it. Our survey was very important. It was some of the comments were read out in the House of Commons.
Mm.
We went through loads and loads of them at the AGM, the hospital AGM, as a result of which they made it single sex. They made that, and then later on, other hospitals followed, and there was a general campaign at that time to make all hospital wards single sex. So that carried on for some time. In 2010, as I'm a lesbian, I set up an LGBT, and it was T in those days, so an LGBT group. This was before. I think this was before. I think this was round about the time of. Well, this was before. I think we had same-sex marriage. I'm not
Mm.
quite. I can't remember now. I can't remember the dates. I think that was in 2014. I can't remember the dates, so ignore that, ignore that bit. But anyway, I decided to set up an LGBT group. It was mainly going to be a social group, and also that we could deliver some LGBT awareness training.
Mm.
As I say, I did have tea in it at that time, and we did have mainly men. I no longer, by the way, use the term trans people or trans men, trans women. I don't use it anymore. No one can change sex. And at that time, I had been involved a lot
in sort of some niche areas of the LGBT community, mainly to do with mental health, going back years. And I met a lot of men who were dressed as women. They weren't saying they were actually women. They just, as we understood it, it was a sexual interest they had. That was what they did for sexual gratification.
Mm.
And they just behaved like men. They just behaved like men who were wearing women's clothes. So we had a few men who dressed as women, who we used all the pronouns, we did all of that. But then the situation emerged where these men wanted to be put on the women's wards. I was under pressure for these men to campaign to have these men put back into the women's wards that I had already campaigned to get men out of. But at that time, we were having problems with I had involved an LGBT charity. It was a pan-London charity, in helping. We had a worker. They helped write the funding bid, and they helped. The idea was that they would help with the sort of admin stuff, the paying wages and stuff. But they kind of took over the group, and it was very, very nasty. At the time, I was ill, but not actually. It wasn't just mental health. I was having surgery, an operation, and things sort of fell apart then. I was taken into the general hospital for an emergency operation. That group sort of dissipated. In the meantime, they had taken my worker, the charity, and had used my worker on our time to set up other LGBT groups in other trusts, one particular trust. And then the next thing you know, that they brought in Stonewall, gendered intelligence, and these organisations, and suddenly it was, and we all know the story then. So at that point I decided this was awful. I realised that and I would say this, Isla, prior to ever being having any length of time in psychiatric hospitals, I was heavily involved in second wave feminism, so I knew the difference between sex and gender. When I would sometimes do this LGBT awareness training, not much, I did a little bit, and then I would say about respecting people's gender identity. And at the time I was saying it, I was thinking, what the hell is gender identity?
Yeah.
I didn't realise it was going to mushroom and get as huge as it has done. So I was just going along with it, paying lip service to it, knowing that my gender identity is a nonsense. I believe it's absolute nonsense. And I would say this: in all the years I had been active in psychiatric wards and mental health campaigning, no one ever said they had gender dysphoria. People would say all sorts of things, that I self-harm, I was abused as a child, or some would say I've got a chemical imbalance in my brain, but most of them it would be about child abuse. No, and you would say to someone, well, one of the little conversation starters would be, what brought you here? And then the person would tell you why they're on the ward. And then no one ever said, I've got gender dysphoria, ever.
No, they didn't. I mean, I worked in sexual health and they didn't say it. Believe me, it was not the thing that came up. No one was going, I've got gender dysphoria. I've got this, such bad discomfort. I need to. I've been born in the wrong body, and this is they didn't.
Anyway, that's right. I then withdrew. I was in a peer support group, mental health peer support group, and I made the mistake of saying I don't think Jeremy Greer should be banned from speaking at an event, and this guy came down on me. The abuse I took was phenomenal, and at that point I realised, no, I've got to now campaign find out what's going on first of all. Of course, you don't campaign, but I had a pretty good idea already, and that's it. So I'm now campaigning to keep men out of psychiatric wards, and I will not accept, having fought so hard to what we did in second wave feminism. We understood gender as the vehicle that to some extent the lies that they told about men and women. Now I know there are people who say, well, there are certain things that are innate, certain sex differences that we might call gender, but women were being oppressed using this tool of gender, that women can't make decisions, women, this, all the problems with women. We fought against those and said, no, that's not who we are. And now for me to, even now when I go into, I recently was again under psychiatric services, mainly because I had, family illness and stuff, and it was quite distressing. Having to I objected to filling in their patient satisfaction survey because they were asking me about my gender, blah blah blah. And for me to even have someone say I'm a cis woman, I'll be defined according to gender. The very things I fought against, that we successfully fought against all those years ago. I see that as I'm having to degrade myself by saying that. That is I just
It's so offensive, isn't it?
It's so offensive.
offensive.
And there's a concept of a moral injury. You know, if someone goes into say hospital and they say their religion is such that they don't eat certain meats, let's say they don't eat pork or bacon or whatever, if they're forced to eat pork and bacon, that is an outrage. And I, as a feminist, as a proper second wave feminist, to have to, like some little mouse, say, oh, this is my gender. And I was campaigning all these years saying gender is not the truth about women. It is the injury to me is enormous.
No, I feel your rage. No, I'm with you.
Yeah.
I totally get it.
So that's it. That I mean, I don't know. I mean, I would be happy to, you know, as I say, I've campaigned for 30 years. I was then campaigning against benefit changes to people with mental distress. But when I did have to leave that peer support group because the level of abuse I was taking was quite phenomenal. And I've since discovered that a lot of the groups that are the campaigning groups that I was involved with are now campaigning for acceptance that trans is a real thing, that we've got to be kind. They're there now, and I can no longer be involved in that kind of activism. Yeah. So that
it's very I mean, I think so many people are probably in the same boat as you, and I think one of the biggest issues that they're facing really is the bed capacity, because even if you'd managed to establish a single-sex environment, what I'm reading from the CQC reports is that right across the country, this ingress because of this overcapacity issue, where they're essentially just breaking that down, and then of course, you know, putting Annex B on top of that. I really do expect that, you know, mixed sex environments are a given, and then obviously the de facto self ID, and then obviously then layer on top the trans positive policies, which are, you know, so standard in many of these trusts. I mean, women don't really have a hope in hell at the moment of being in having their privacy, dignity, and security maintained. Look, so
you know, it's for me, it's a priority that we get organisations like Stonewall and Gendered Intelligence out of the NHS completely. They shouldn't be there. When I see any member of staff, hospital staff, wearing the rainbow Leonard, and bear in mind I am a lesbian, for me each time it's like it's an injury. I sustain a psychological injury every time I see that, and yet I think a lot of them aren't even aware.
It says they don't care about you, effectively. And I think that women in mental health wards are a real forgotten, vulnerable group.
We are.
You know,
and I know that there is a big campaign to get men out of women's prisons, which obviously I support, and I've been on a couple of protests about that. And I was always saying, well, similar situation, in some senses worse on a psychiatric ward, because if a man beats up a woman or any beats up another patient, they may have their sentence increased, but there's no, but they can do it without any comeback on a psychiatric ward. Although I do understand that strategically it's important to campaign against for all sorts of reasons, it's important to campaign for women's safety in prison. But I do understand that recently it became public knowledge that they had specifically targeted prisons as a place to put men claiming to be women into prisons. But it's very similar in terms of the vulnerability. I also think that people will be more sympathetic to women in psychiatric wards than to women prisoners, because they think, well, she's committed a crime. On the other hand, there's a general sense that people think a psychiatric ward, you're in the best place if you're not well. They're looking after you.
I think people have always been very frightened of mental health problems.
So, I am still campaigning on mental health, but I'm very concerned about the mental health impact of this on women,
Mm.
especially women who don't accept this ideology, because we are being brutalised. I was forced out of our peer support group. I was saying it, I was being abused terribly. I said, I'm actually starting to feel suicidal as a result of this level of abuse. Now, I have been seriously suicidal. I've been rushed to hospital, with an ambulance with, flashing lights after suicide attempts. It's something that I have done a number of times, not thousands of times, but there have been very serious attempts.
Mm.
These people that were in this peace group knew this, and yet they didn't stop abusing me. And at this point, I thought, well, this is not about suicide prevention.
Mm.
I realised then that
Mm.
because they clearly didn't give a damn.
Mm.
So and also the idea that people with when you go into a psychiatric, if you're, let's say you have a psychosis, you're delusional, no member of staff is going to say, oh, well, you're quite right, Denise, you were abducted by aliens last night and they did remove your lungs and your heart, and we'll give you a paracetamol for the pain. No one would say that. They'd say, no, Denise, that didn't happen. Really, it didn't happen.
Mm.
That's not so. And yet, now, and I do know that now, I do know in some wards there are men who claim to women. Now, if a woman says there's a man in the ward, they'll be told, no, you're imagining it.
Mm.
So then, if a woman is told she wasn't actually abducted by aliens and this, that, the other didn't actually happen, is she to believe it? Who should believe
Yeah.
her own, ideas? Because if they're lying to her about that one thing, what the hell else are they lying about? It's really it is gaslighting. You do not gaslight people who are mentally so unstable that they are, tottering on the brink of,
Yeah, exactly. They're already
yeah,
confused and unsure about what's going on,
yeah,
what is
yeah,
reality and what's not.
yeah. That's right.
Well, look, I'm really grateful. Incredible story to tell, and I'm really grateful for your time. I think it's really powerful, and I think people will really benefit from hearing it, Denise. So thank you very much for coming.
Thanks very much, Hyla.
know,
Thank you.
and
Thanks a lot.
telling it.
Thank you. Bye bye.